What I'd like to do is talk about a couple of events that set the stage for the Nexus, briefly talk about some of the history that contributed to us defining ourselves as the Chautauqua Nexus. Whenever I think about that issue, I think about Ed Brinson saying to me, "Joe, we need an acronym. We need an acronym, something that people can remember." And I said, "Whatever." And we talked about it and we argued and we came up with the Chautauqua Nexus. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Chautauqua and a couple of variations on the Chautauqua. Tell you a little bit about our past, some of the things that we've done, because we did some. When I looked over the things that we did during the 10 years that we were sort of active, we had some very nice presentations, and that was because we had a lot of input and a lot of support from people in the community, professors and students, and just people in the community offered to help us out. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about where we are right now and what we're trying to do. In a lot of ways, this semester, we're trying to force ourselves to go very slow, to get grounded, and then to think about where we want to go from here. So, whereas at one point when we were doing the Nexus, we had events on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings, we're not doing that right now. We're going to try and maybe do 3 or 4 more events between now and the end of the semester, and then maybe next fall have bi-monthly events and so forth. And we're also exploring other venues in addition to this sort of speaker series venue, although this doesn't have to be limited to a speaker series by any means. So anyhow, we'll talk about the present, and then of course what we'll do is we'll talk about the future. Scott's going to talk in a little while. Hope knows that she is free to intervene at any time. And so let me just lay a couple of things out here. I know that Hope is probably going to admonish me for starting with something negative, but I do want to tell you how this started. When I was a student at the University of Oklahoma, I used my phone to keep track of time, so I hope you don't mind me doing this. When I was a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, we used to have a Friday afternoon lunch bunch where graduate students would mix with faculty members, and we would talk about our research. And to tell you the truth, that was pretty much the only stuff that we ever talked about was our research. When I came to ULM, of course, I've been here almost 25 years. So when I came here, it was NLU. I tried to start that lunch bunch, and I couldn't get it to work. I got 1 or 2 other faculty members to buy in, but what it turned out to be was me talking one week, Steve talking the next week, me talking the next week, Steve talking the next week, and so forth and so on. And that wasn't what we really wanted it to be. So we got very frustrated, and we changed. We said, well, instead of just talking about research, why don't we talk about ideas? And we tried that. That didn't work. And then we said, well, surely we can open it up and just talk about interesting things that happen during the course of the week. I mean, we work at universities. You would think that interesting things would happen. That didn't work either. So to use Steve's language, Steve studied sensation and perception, we couldn't get a critical mass. And so I started thinking, well, maybe other departments on our campus were running into a similar problem. Maybe they couldn't reach a critical mass either. And then I thought, well, maybe if we got a small number of people from this department to work together with a small number of people from this department and so forth and so on, we would get our critical mass. And that was really what led to the Nexus in many ways. Then I lucked out, and this was thanks really to Ed. Ed was extremely well connected to the community and very well connected to the artistic part of our community. And so Ed invited me to go to a Saturday morning breakfast group with him. And as it turns out, it was almost always a bunch of other guys. In all the years that I went, I only remember one female going one time. I don't think anybody in that group even came close to being sexist, but the fact of the matter is it was a bunch of guys. And going to those Saturday morning breakfast groups was like going to a party. It reminded me of college, except that instead of drinking beer, we were drinking coffee, and a lot of it. And for those of you that are coffee drinkers, you know what that could be like. So anyhow, we would meet sometimes for hours on end talking about whatever. It was obviously highly unstructured because it was a Saturday morning breakfast group. We didn't have any technology or anything like that. And I remember thinking that what we were doing was a great thing, and that I was fortunate to be a part of that, but that we needed to do something like that out at the university, because at that time our university was struggling in many ways, and one of those was that we weren't really appreciated by the community, I think, to the extent that maybe we could have been. And so we started thinking in terms of having something like that Saturday morning breakfast group out at the university. And that was how the Nexus came to be. Well, when we were talking about names, I like the Nexus because I like the idea of coming together. I'm a researcher at heart, and so I see people as people. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm obnoxious. My students know better, of course. I just do a good job of pretending that I'm obnoxious. All right, but I know that you're people, but from a researcher's perspective, each of us is like a factor. If you like to think in terms of physiology, it's like each of us is a package of neurons. And so the question is, what happens when you take a factor like Jason and you make a compound with a factor like Scott? And so now you're in a position where you can get much more in terms of power than you could from either one by itself. So I like the idea of bringing people together, especially if you allow for the possibility that we have talent in our community, which we do. And I remember thinking about that many, many times during those Saturday morning breakfast groups about how much talent we have in our community and how we underestimate ourselves and how we underappreciate ourselves and so forth. So anyhow, I thought of the word Nexus. And then Ed said something about the Chautauqua. I think that was after he talked with Perry Jones. And we said, okay, so we'll call it the Chautauqua Nexus. And then when people said, oh, that's going to be so hard to pronounce, we said, well, we'll change that to the Washita Chautauqua Nexus for those that are having a hard time with the pronunciation. And of course, I was joking about that. But what I did learn about the Chautauqua, not just the Chautauqua in New York, which Scott is going to talk about, probably at greater length than me, was that there was a Methodist tradition many years ago, before sort of the explosion in electronics, and it was likened to a traveling circus. And when I first heard that, my knee-jerk reaction was, I don't know if I want to model ourselves after a circus, because I think of circuses as freak shows, and I didn't want us to think about ourselves as a freak show. But what I failed to appreciate was that at an earlier point in history, people had very limited access to information. And so circuses would go from town to town, and what they would do is they would bring information from the world to other communities. And then what they did, and this is where the idea of a circus became interesting, was they would share that information within the context of an entertaining model. So the idea was, let's educate through entertainment. And when we first started the Nexus, we had hoped that that's what we would do on a weekly basis. And we failed to do that on a weekly basis. But on the other hand, we didn't fail completely, because there were many times when we had Nexus events that were extremely entertaining. And that goes back to the fact that we have a lot of talent in our community. So the Nexus came from this traveling circus idea. And then, of course, there's Chautauqua, New York. And the thing that I want to mention about Chautauqua, New York is that I think that Chautauqua, New York could serve as a model for Downtown Monroe. And Chautauqua, New York is all about cultural development and economic growth. And so, like I said, Scott will talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. All right, so a couple of quick points about our past. At the time of our inception, our goal was to help ULM become more of a regional center for cultural and intellectual exchange. I remember having breakfast one day and talking about this, and initially we said something about intellectual exchange, and then Jim Moore, who was one of our first presenters, said that he thought that was obnoxious because intellectual might be inviting to some people, but it might be a turnoff to other people. And so he suggested that instead of simply thinking about it as intellectual exchange, that we expand it and we think about it more in terms of cultural interaction. And he was right on the money. And so we said that what we wanted to do was to help ULM become more of a regional center for cultural and intellectual exchange, and secondarily, to help Monroe become more of a regional cultural mecca or a regional center. Obviously, the word mecca has the potential to work for some people, and it has the potential to work against us as well. And so when I talked about this with Rod Washington a couple of weeks ago, he said, well, why don't we just think about it as a cultural center? And I think that in a lot of ways he was right on the money. The goal was to bring people to ULM. Like I said a couple of moments ago, ULM was struggling. And we were having a hard time keeping our students on our campus. We were having a hard time bringing people to our campus. And that's no longer the case. And so it makes more sense to think about other venues, and downtown seems like a nice option. We ran for approximately 10 years. We stopped about 6 years ago. I used to tell people that we did it with no money. And I got to thinking about that last night, and that was kind of misleading. Because to tell you the truth, we had a lot of support from different people. Like, for example, ULM was very supportive. They let us use the student center at no charge. They let us use the 6th floor of the administration building at no charge. They let us use room 134 over in computer science at no charge. They also gave us an opportunity to create flyers that we distributed all around the campus and all around the community at no charge. There were people who volunteered their time at no charge. There were students who helped me to put things together at no charge. And so I didn't really think about that as financial support until I started to become more involved with grants. And then once I became involved with grants, I started thinking in terms of in-kind. And if you know anything about grants, you know that there are a lot of different ways of interpreting in-kind. The Palace right now is not charging us anything, but they're providing us with a tremendous venue. They could have charged us. At one point I thought they were going to, and it scared the bejeebies out of me. Corey Barr has offered to let us use Cotton twice a month on Saturday mornings at no charge. So all of those things count. And like I said, at one point I failed to appreciate that. We also got a grant through the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and there's no doubt that as the Nexus goes forward, we can look for more funding opportunities. LEH funded a particular series which we call the Origin Series. And the purpose of the Origin Series was to either make people aware of or to remind people of the fact that places like Poverty Point and Wasson Brake have a great deal of historical significance. And I didn't know about that. As an outsider, I was totally clueless until people like Joe Saunders, our regional archaeologist, brought that to our attention. And so on some level, I started thinking about the possibility that maybe Monroe could have the same potential as a place like Poverty Point did in its heyday. And that's why I thought of it as a potential regional center or mecca. We started on Friday afternoons at 4:30. I remember Ed and I arguing about when are we going to meet. So we decided to pick the most ridiculous time imaginable, which was Fridays on 4:30. And to tell you the truth, it kind of worked. But then it expanded, and it went from Fridays at 4:30 to Monday, Tuesday, Thursday evenings. We even had a couple of Saturday afternoon presentations, right? I think Michael Shane Duvall, one of our presenters. Michael did 3 different Nexus events for us, and I think you did one of those at Enoch's, didn't you? Yeah, so I mean, it's almost like anything is possible. We never touched Wednesday, we never touched Sunday for obvious reasons, but every other time seemed to work. Attendance, once we sort of stabilized, we typically got between 35 and 50 people, and I mention that because what I'm trying to sell people on is the idea that if we succeed, or as we succeed, if we could have between 35 and 50 people down here at different times of the week throughout a semester, that should have implications for economic growth. Like, there might be businesses that would find that attractive. especially if you take into consideration the other things that are going on, like, for example, the art crawl. So we sometimes had as many as 150, like after 9/11, we did a couple of special events, and we kind of packed people in for that, and I think that was pretty much for obvious reasons. The country was in shock, and everyone was kind of clueless, and we tried to see what we could do to be helpful along those lines. We had faculty from various universities. We reached out to Tech. We reached out to Grambling. At that time, Louisiana Delta was not an issue. But we had some success reaching out to Tech and to Grambling. We included not just faculty, but students. We also had administrators make presentations. There were people from the community, not only Michael, but also Ed did a presentation. Ricky, you're a student, so I wouldn't think of you in those terms. So we had a variety of people who would make presentations. Just to give you an idea of some of the events that we had, our first event was right around Election Day, and I remember that because my birthday is November 5th. And my mother sent me a check for my birthday, and I used that check in order to pay for an ad in the, what was the student newspaper? What was it? What did it used to be? The Powwow? Yeah, I wrote a check for the Powwow, and we were advertising, to come to the Nexus. But it was right around Election Day, and so we had, I wish I could remember their last names. I know Jim Moore's last name was Jim Moore, but Joe also made a presentation at the same time as Jim. When you drive over I-20, and when you drive on I-20 and you go over the Ouachita River, I think it's now World War II. What's it called? World War II Memorial. Well, that's thanks to Joe. All right, and Joe had a really interesting story to share with us, and really that was in a lot of ways one of the things that we wanted to do with the Nexus was to share interesting stories. Joe was like 16 years old during World War II. He lied about his age. He was a sailor, and he commandeered one of those landing craft that landed on Normandy. And he said he was in the second wave, so he was about 6 minutes away from us landing troops on the beaches of Normandy. And he talked with us about that. And Crane? Joe Crane. And so, he talked with us about patriotism, and then Jim told us about some of his experiences, and we just thought that made a lot of sense to do around Election Day, and it worked. And I remember the second event too. Eric Paney and his students. Eric was a professor of geosciences, or at least he was for a long time. He and his students competed in an event. They won, and so we asked them to talk with us about their event, and that worked just fine. We had other faculty members who talked about the history of the university, ethics. We had President Kofer talk about academic freedom. We had Glenn Kennedy do a Nexus on a Saturday where he talked about painting the heavens. If you haven't had a chance to go to St. Matthew's Church, which is like right down the block, one of these days you should. All right, and when you do, you should look up at the ceiling, because Glenn painted that ceiling, and he painted it with a 3.5-inch brush, which I could appreciate because I frequently painted my house with like a 2.5-inch brush, and I know how hard that was, and he did it with a 3.5-inch brush, and so he talked with us about what it was like to paint the ceiling of St. Matthew's Church. Kind of a good example of Monroe, because it is so precious, and yet so few people probably know about it. But when you look at it, it's like, I can't believe that that's there, and I can't believe that one of our local artists did that. Glenn had an enormous amount of talent. There's no doubt that Glenn was a major force in the Nexus. And when Glenn died some number of years ago, they had a eulogy for him at St. Matthew's Church. And one of the things that Father Joe did was he asked the members of the audience, if you will, for lack of better words, if anybody wanted to say anything about Glenn. And I did, but I didn't. I did want to say something, but I chose not to. My wife was next to me at the time, and when I did things like that in public, it used to make her a little bit nervous. I remember her looking at me like, "Are you going to do this?" But anyhow, what I wanted to do was I wanted to thank Glenn. All right, because there's no doubt that Glenn was a major factor in helping me to think about this project and helping Ed and I to go forward with it. So Glenn talked about painting the heavens. Michael, I always call Michael Shane Duvall. What do you even like to go by?
Anything that's not a four-letter word, even if
I can think of 2 words that amount to 6 letters, but we'll leave that one alone. All right. Anyhow, Michael talked about a couple of the books that he's written. I think he did 3 different nexuses. Ed did a nexus which we entitled Arena Thinkball, which is one of my favorite titles. Sue Edmonds, who is now with the Monroe Chamber of Commerce, did one on tolerance, innovation, and economic growth. I've mentioned that many, many times over the years. We had a student from West Monroe High School talk about the origin of cursing, and it was a lot of fun to listen to him just cut up right and left, especially knowing that his mother was like sitting in the front row. But he had a good time, and we had a good time. We had students from West Monroe High School put on a theater production. We had Richard Hood, who is an outstanding, a very, very fine musician, do probably a couple of nexuses for us, and one of them was on Mark Twain, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time he performed. We had pretty much what amounted to a concert by Brian Sibbles. I think he did 2 events, and I have to tell you briefly about one of those, which was my favorite. He did it on the 6th floor of the library. We were in the media conference room, and he's a rock and roller, all right. He does blues, but he's a rock and roller, and he likes to play loud music. And I remember listening to him warm up, and I got to thinking, we're in a library. There are people studying next door. I'm not so sure about this blasting the roof off. So I went next door to see if they could hear him, and sure enough, they could hear him because he was loud. And I came back and I said, Brian, I think you need to tone it down a little bit because we're in a library. And he said, oh, okay, we'll do that, Joe. And at that point, instead of turning the dial down, he turned the dial up, and he just blasted it that much more. And I think it was at that point that we decided we needed to switch to another location. Because even though the acoustics were fabulous, the idea of having a concert in the library was a little bit bizarre. We also watched films. I remember Ed showing us a film about one of Charlie Chaplin's films. I remember us watching Animal House and having some fun with that. We watched The Matrix. I did a couple of nexuses, and this one meant a great deal to me, where I talked about the movie Pleasantville. I don't know if you've seen the movie Pleasantville, but it's definitely a movie which is worth watching. And I think the way I could sum up Pleasantville in the fewest number of words is that it's about how people become black and white and shades of gray when they lose their color. And the color in this case, I think, represented culture and passion. And so in the movie, what happens is they rediscover that passion. And as they rediscover that passion, the black and the white and the shades of gray, they sort of melt away. And what's under the black and white and shades of gray is color. There's just a lot of color, all sorts of colors. And so as I watched Pleasantville, it reminded me of Monroe, all right, because I think that we have the potential to be a lot of black and white and shades of gray. And it also reminded me of ULM. And so the nexus that I did was ULM, Monroe, and Pleasantville. And in some ways, that nexus was the one that got us working on our campus, because our campus used to leave an awful lot to be desired. And I remember President Kofer telling me, he may have told me this in order to make me feel good, but I think he said that what we were doing in what we call People's Parks, which are right next to Strauss Hall, were in a lot of ways an inspiration to him when it came to the reclaiming of the campus, which is why it looks the way it does right now. Right? And there's always work to be done. There's no doubt about that. But our campus just looks so much better now than it did many moons ago. I did one on awe, which was nothing but an unstructured conversation, and I love that one because that's what I had really hoped that the Nexus would be. It was pretty much an unstructured conversation where different people had an opportunity to contribute, share their thoughts and their perspectives. And then, of course, we did the Origin series with Joe Saunders and Rick Stevens. At present, what we're thinking is that there's really stuff going on downtown Monroe. I have to tell you, I worked in construction for years. And when I worked in construction, I used to go to a city and I would look for construction cranes. Because to me, construction cranes meant money. We sold products for various types of contractors. And when I came down here the other day, I noticed a construction crane across the street. Steve and I were talking about this just a few minutes ago. And when I saw that construction crane, I thought, wow, this is really happening. And of course, as you walk down the street, I don't think you'll notice this if you drive down the street, but if you walk down the street and you walk around in the community, you'll notice that there are various projects that are beginning to take off. And a lot of that has to do with probably a whole wide variety of people, but the two that I know the most, or the two that are the most influential, are Vantage and Michael Eccles. And of course, Michael is affiliated with Vantage, but I think Michael is in a lot of ways a private entrepreneur as well. So as you see things starting to sprout up, I think a lot of the credit goes to those two as well as to others. And I'm telling you that in the 30 years or so that I've been familiar with Monroe, even though I've only worked here 25 years, my wife was originally from here. And my father-in-law used to own a store across the street, Gay's Clothing. And so I remember coming downtown and George saying to me, Joe, what do you think we could do in order to make this place more lively? And I said I thought that a university presence would have a major effect. And so for almost 30 years, there really hasn't been very much going on downtown. But now there is, up to and including, for example, the River Market, which has the potential to be an enormous success. I think Myra Gatling estimated that something like 7,000 people turned out for one of their opening events last year. And they're getting ready to start again on April 15th. And what we want to do is we want to build on that excitement. So there's stuff happening downtown. And then, of course, I also think it's important to remind people of what Louisiana Tech is doing over in Ruston. And that is their Research Park initiative. And I think that Louisiana Tech ought to be applauded and then thanked for what they're doing with their Research Park, because I think it opens us up to all sorts of potential. And one of the points that I've tried to make often is that the only thing better than a research park in Ruston is a research park in Ruston as part of a research and development corridor that includes at least our neck of the woods and their neck of the woods. And so I think that what's going on downtown and what's going on in Ruston does suggest that this is a good time for northern Louisiana, a good time to bring the Nexus back. But instead of bringing people to the ULM campus, what we want to do is we want to bring people downtown. And we want to bring people downtown in large numbers. So to this end, thanks to Randy Empson and Corey Barr, among others, we're fortunate to be able to work at the Palace and the Cotton. And we're allowing for the possibility that there might be other venues available to us as we go forward. I know, for example, last year, Vantage was kind enough to offer their space. And even though we're not ready to take advantage of that offer, at some point down the road we might. So tonight's event was really an attempt to kind of get the ball rolling. Next week, Michael Eccles is going to be talking, and we really would love for that to be a resounding success, because in a lot of ways, that's the true beginning of the next phase of the Nexus. Michael is going to be talking about, what's the title of his talk? Do you remember? Downtown Revitalization. So one of the things that we're going to try and do this time is we're going to try and be a little bit more thematic than in the past. I remember when we started the Nexus, Ed and I met with Dean Safari. Dean Safari, he worked over by the ULM Foundation. And when we were talking, he said, you know, Joe, this sounds so much like the show Seinfeld, right? Because what you guys are talking about is anybody could get up and talk about essentially nothing. And, of course, what I wanted to say was, well, I don't know that I want to talk about nothing. I would prefer to think that we were talking about anything. But the fact of the matter is that may have ended up working against us. And so this time around, instead of having lots and lots and lots of different events where people could talk about essentially anything, which actually did have some appeal, we want to have fewer events where they're more structured and more defined and more thematic. And so that's what we're putting together for the balance of this semester. In addition to Michael, I'm pretty sure that Melody Olson is going to be talking. If you're not familiar with Melody, Melody is a major player downtown. She is a tremendous resource for the city, and it sounds to me like she is almost like a default. When people are unsure of what to do, they go to Melody. And so when Melody and I had lunch a couple of weeks ago, I asked her if she'd be willing to do a Nexus, and she said yes. And so we're going to try and see if we can pin down a date for her. I also talked with Brian Civils to see if maybe he would be willing to do a performance. And I have to tell you that one of the nice things about Brian is not only is he an outstanding musician, Brian is an educator at heart. And so when he performs, he teaches you about the music that he's performing. And we really like that because, you know, as an organization, we're pretty much educators. And so an opportunity to teach people to us was great. And then another event which right now we're thinking about, we're not going to be able to do it this semester, but we would like to be able to talk about it, and it's possible that this is what we could use cotton for, is a photography exhibition that would be entitled Our Town. And I've run this by quite a few people, up to and including the mayor's office, Rod Washington in particular, and they really liked that idea. And so the idea, I had this idea a couple of years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I had an opportunity to go to Oxford for a conference that was sponsored by the Oxford Roundtable. And when I was there, I had a chance to go to London. I spent a couple of weekends in London. And I saw people walking around with cameras, taking pictures of everything. And I found myself wondering, you know, what would it be like if we took a bunch of kids from Monroe over here and gave them cameras and set them loose? What would they take pictures of? And then after I thought about that a little longer, I thought, well, what if we turned them loose in their own neighborhood? What would they take pictures of? Now, of course, there's a big difference between Monroe, Louisiana, and the gardens outside of Buckingham Palace. But the point is that what they take pictures of might be really important for us to see, sort of introduce us to the phenomenology of their life. And I like that idea, and people seem to like that idea when I run it by them. And so the idea of putting together a photography exhibition seems to have some appeal, and I think we're going to do that. And so that's one of the other events that we're planning right now. So at this point, we're in a position to talk about our future, and I want to give Scott an opportunity to talk about his vision for the Nexus and what he'd like to do, and then we'll essentially be very close to closing up at that point. And what we could do is talk about what you think we could do